Caroline, Book 2, Chapter 15. Last chapter in the book. This book. Independence Day, Chapter 15. Once the cows were settled, Caroline slipped from the spring house and latched the door behind her. For a moment, she felt a sense of triumph. She had hidden the cows. But where was the thief? Was he still stuffing his pockets in the garden? Caroline didn't dare confront him. But I should try to get a better look at him, she thought. If she could describe the thief, Uncle Aaron might be able to catch him. Caroline crept to the cowshed, slipped inside, and grabbed a pitchfork from among the tools hanging on one wall. She couldn't imagine using it to defend herself, but holding it made her feel braver. Then she peeked around the door frame. Across the yard, the garden gate stood wide open. She held her breath. Had the thief already dug up all the radishes and tiny carrots and slipped back into the woods? Maybe he decided to raid the cabin too. But no. As she watched, the intruder walked out through the garden gate. He wore a brown hat pulled low and dark trousers with his red shirt. Caroline jerked backwards so that he wouldn't see her, and the pitchfork banged into a sickle hanging on the wall. It fell to the ground, clattering against a tin pail. It sounded as loud as thunder. Caroline's heart jumped to her throat as the thief froze, staring straight at her. Then he began to run. If he'd come toward her, Caroline would have turned and raced all the way to Sackett's Harbor. Instead, the thief was running away, and without giving it any thought, Caroline tightened her grip on the pitchfork and ran after him. The thief pounded along the edge of Uncle Aaron's field. Although he had a head start, Caroline managed to gain on him. He was barefoot. Several times he seemed to step on a stone or a stick and took several hops from one foot before running on. Caroline raced after him. Her fear slid away, replaced with anger. She would scare this thief so that he'd never want to steal again. At the back corner of the field, he turned down the path that led to the stream. Caroline had nearly caught up with him when she caught one foot on a root. She stumbled and almost fell. When she looked up again, the path ahead was empty. Where could the thief have gone? Caroline stopped, gasping for breath, searching the underbrush for any telltale movement or flash of red cloth. Everything was still and silent. He must be here somewhere, she thought, bewildered. Then she remembered the dead sycamore, the one with the hollow trunk. Holding the pitchfork firmly in both hands, she crept toward the tree. The opening faced away from her, but as she got close, she saw a pair of dirty feet poking from the hidey hole. She tiptoed over, circling around the trunk. The thief was crammed inside the tree, sitting with his knees pulled up against his chest. He was younger than she'd expected, maybe 12 or 14. Was he a young boy from the Navy who'd run away from his ship? Come out of there, Caroline demanded. After a moment, the boy crept from out into the open. Don't hurt me, he begged, eyeing the pitchfork. Please don't poke me with that. He looked so frightened that Caroline lowered the pitchfork. She was still angry, though. You have no right to be sneaking around, stealing things that don't belong to you. The boy shoved his hands into his pockets, hunched his shoulders, and stared at his toes. I didn't think anyone was home, he mumbled. That doesn't make it right, Caroline glared at him. Well, why have you been stealing? The boy was quiet for a long moment. Then his knees seemed to buckle and he folded to the ground. He buried his face in his hands, but not before Caroline saw tears welling in his eyes. I'm just so hungry, he whispered. Caroline's anger drained away. For the first time, she noticed how thin the boy was and how ragged and dirty his clothes were. What's your name? She asked gently. Robbie, he managed, wiping at his eyes. Robbie Parkhurst. Caroline chewed her lower lip, wishing Uncle Aaron and Lydia were here. They weren't, though. It was up to her to can't handle the situation. Come along, Robbie, she said. She grabbed his hand and pulled him to his feet. Let's go find you some food. A short while later, Caroline sat at the table in the cabin watching Robbie wolf the cornmeal mush and fried fish she'd put in front of him. When he was finished, he wiped the plate with his fingers and licked them clean. Thank you, he said. I surely appreciate your kindness. I'll be going now. He started to rise. No, wait, Caroline protested. Please. Robbie reluctantly dropped back down on the bench. Why are you so hungry? Caroline asked. Don't you have parents? My father was a soldier, Robbie said quietly. He was killed in the battle at Sackett Harbor. The grief in his eyes made Caroline's heart ache. I'm sorry, she said. My papa fought in that battle, and I know it was horrible. What about your mother? My mama always followed the army, Robbie told her. Me and my two little sisters, too. Mama did the laundry for the men in my father's regiment, and my sisters and I did chores. In return, the army gave us blankets and a little food. But now, he spread his hands, palms up. Once Papa got killed, we had to leave the regiment. Caroline frowned. Why? Couldn't your mother keep washing clothes for the soldiers? Army regulations say that once a woman gets widowed, she either has to marry another soldier or move on, Robbie explained. Mama's not ready to marry again. She's broken-hearted about Pa. We've got no family anywhere near, so we just set out down the road. Caroline couldn't imagine simply wandering with nowhere to go. What happened? Robbie shrugged sadly. My mama hasn't been able to think straight. She's been sickly too. When we came to an abandoned farm near here, I decided we should hole up until she got stronger and we could figure out what to do next. The cabin roof has fallen in, but there's an animal shed yet standing. We've been staying there. I've tried to keep us fed with wild greens and frogs and such, but I can't always find enough. Caroline looked away. What a terrible situation. Please don't tell anyone, Robbie begged. Pa would be ashamed if he could see us now. Were you the one that set up the fishing line across the creek? Caroline asked. Robbie nodded. I've never fished before, though, and I must have baited the hooks wrong. Everyone was empty when I got back. He rubbed a rough spot on the table with his thumb. It got so my sisters couldn't sleep at night. They were so hungry, they just cried. That's when I started stealing. I know it's wrong, but his voice faded away. Caroline got up and walked to the window, trying to think. She understood that Robbie was truly desperate. Stealing was wrong. And yet, if someone in her family wept from hunger, she might do the same thing. I'm feeling better after this meal, Robbie said. I'll just go and collect my family and we'll set off for someplace new. No one needs to know. Caroline faced him. I can't keep this a secret. From my Uncle Aaron and cousin Lydia, this is their farm, and you eaten some of their food. Robbie's hung his head. But I'm sure they'll understand, Caroline added. She looked around the cabin. There was precious little food inside, and not much yet ripe in the garden, and she'd come here to help her relatives, not give their food away. But Uncle Aaron trusted me enough to leave me alone today, she thought. I have to make the best choice I can. And with that, she knew exactly what to do. We don't have much food to spare, Caroline told Robbie, but let me see what I can find, and we'll take it to your family. He stared at her with wide eyes. Honest? Shall we take some milk for your sister? She asked. But, uh, she made a face. It will taste like leeks. That's no matter at all, he assured her. He jumped to his feet, looking downright hopeful. They'll be ever so pleased. Caroline walked to the abandoned farm with Robbie. The small clearing was silent. Robbie led her to the rickety shed. Inside, two little girls with dirty faces and big eyes sat huddled in one corner. Mrs. Parkhurst, who looked completely done in with grief and hunger, lay on a blanket. A canvas sack hung on the wall. That sack, Caroline thought, must hold everything the Parkers have left in this world. The girls scooted away when they saw Caroline follow Robbie inside. Mrs. Parkhurst tried to sit up. She looked alarmed. Please don't worry, Caroline told them gently. Robbie and I brought a little food. Robbie set down a crock of cornmeal mush. Caroline carefully poured milk from another crock into a tin cup. She offered it to Mrs. Parkhurst, who waved a hand toward her daughters. If you'd be so kind, she said, please feed my girls first. The girls drank greedily. They didn't seem to mind the flavor of the wild leeks. We considered that milk ruined, Caroline thought. She'd been worried about Lydia and Uncle Aaron having enough food. Compared to the Parkhursts, though, the Livingston family was eating very well indeed. Caroline noticed Mrs. Parkhurst soothing her hair as if she were uncomfortable to have a stranger see her in such a sad state. I need to go now, Caroline told them, but I'll be back later, I promise. When Uncle Aaron and Lydia returned home that afternoon, Caroline told them everything that had happened. I'm sorry I gave away food without your permission, she said. I just couldn't bear to see anyone so hungry. Uncle Aaron put his hands on her shoulder, just as Papa might have done when he had something important to tell her. You did just fine today, Caroline. First you protected the cows, then you helped a family that is truly in need. I'm proud of you. Caroline felt a glow spread inside. Thank you, Uncle Aaron. He cocked his head toward the door. Now let's go fetch the Parkers. They can sleep snug under our roof tonight. By the time the Parkers were settled into the loft in the Livingston's cabin, darkness had cloaked the farm. Lydia and Caroline lit a lantern and walked to the cowshed to check on Minerva and Garnet. I felt awful about spoiling Minerva's milk, but you should have seen how Robbie's sisters drink it down, Caroline said slowly. Even though my family's been living in the middle of war in Sackett's Harbor, we never had to worry about where our next meal was coming from or where to live. I'll never feel sorry for myself for not having sugar again, Lydia declared. She picked up 2 curry brushes and handed them to Caroline. The girls spent some time brushing the cows. Garnet pranced about for only a moment before she quieted down and let Caroline soothe out her red coat. Good girl, Caroline whispered. Thank you for helping me today. When she and Lydia started back to the cabin, Caroline paused to admire the stars twinkling overhead. These were the same stars she'd seen from her own home, the same stars that sailors used to help guide their ships on the great waters of Lake Ontario. Those stars reminded Caroline that she was still connected to her family and to Sackett's Harbor. Caroline had long dreamed of sailing her own ship, letting the winds and stars help steer her course. That longing would always fill her heart. But I will try hard not to feel homesick here and to feel sorry for myself because I don't have a ship, she promised herself. For someone like Robbie, her dreams would seem like luxuries indeed. The cabin door opened. In the shadows, Caroline saw Uncle Aaron step outside and stroll across the yard to join them. I've just had a good talk with Robbie and his mother, he told Caroline and Lydia. I've convinced them to stay with us for a few days to gather their strength. In return, they'll help us with chores. Miss Parker seems like a sensible woman. Once she had a few good meals and a chance to rest, she will be able to decide what she wants to do next. Caroline and Lydia exchanged delighted smiles. That is a wonderful plan, Lydia said. Uncle Aaron turned to Caroline. When Mrs. Parkhurst's here to help us, we can spare you for a few days. Would you like to celebrate Independence Day in Sackett's Harbor? Caroline gasped, then threw her arms around her uncle. Oh, yes, I'll come back and help here afterward, but oh, I did so want to be home on Independence Day. Uncle Aaron laughed. And so you shall be. And he tipped his head back and looked at the stars. It's a fine night. It is, Caroline said happily. It is indeed. Independence Day in Sackett's Harbor was everything that Caroline had hoped it would be. Townspeople and military men gathered by the harbor. Several of the officers gave rousing speeches. Caroline swelled with pride as they spoke of defending their young country. Then every ship in the harbor fired a gun salute in honor of American independence. Boom, boom, boom. The noise shuddered over the water. Caroline gazed north toward the British troops in Upper Canada that had twice attacked her village. We are still Americans, she told them silently. We are continuing to fight until you let us be. When the official ceremony was over, the Abbott family and their workers and friends shared a picnic at the shipyard. The men set up big tables and the ladies set out bowls and baskets of food. The sun was hot, but a breeze rustled the American flag flying over Abbott's. Caroline smiled as she watched the people she loved enjoy the afternoon. She was finishing a bowl of wild strawberries served in cream, sweet cream, that didn't taste like leeks when she heard Papa calling her. Yes, Papa. Caroline put her bowl aside and hurried to join him. Will you walk with me? Of course. She studied his face anxiously, wondering if he had bad news to tell her, but Papa's face was calm. She took his hand. Close your eyes, he instructed. The corners of his mouth crinkled as if he was trying to hide a smile. I'll guide you. Where was Papa taking her? Caroline felt an exciting tingle as she closed her eyes and let him lead her away. After a moment, she heard a hollow sound of wood beneath her shoes. Papa had brought her to the dock. You can look now, Papa said. Caroline opened her eyes and saw a sweet little skiff sailing into the harbor, heading toward the shipyard. The sight sparked a bittersweet memory. It looks like Sparrow, she said. Papa's eyes were merry. It is. What? Caroline squinted toward the skiff. It did look just like Sparrow. Mr. Tate was sailing the skiff. As it drew closer, he dropped the sail so he could row to the dock. Caroline turned to her father with astonishment. But I sank the Sparrow in Hickory Creek weeks ago. I ruined her. Not quite ruined, her father said. Ever since you told me what happened, I've wanted to raise the skiff so I could see if the damage could be repaired. I knew it would please you. A lump rose in Caroline's throat. With all that Papa had to worry about, all he had to do, he thought about raising the skiff to please her. That morning, when Aaron's letter arrived, Papa continued, I knew you didn't want to leave home. Yes, you went without complaint. It helped me realize how much you've grown up since the war began. Caroline opened her mouth, then closed it again. She couldn't find words. So Mr. Tate and I salvaged the skiff. As it turned out, the damage was easy to repair. Papa's voice was full of mischief. And once the woodwork was sound, I decided the skiff needed a new name. He pointed. The skiff had almost reached the dock. Grinning, Mr. Tate used the oars to turn the boat broadside. Caroline gasped when she saw the new name spelled out in fresh blue paint. Miss Caroline. Would you like to go for a sail? Papa asked. Caroline clapped her hands. Oh, yes. Soon she and Papa were settled into the skiff. Their friends and family waved from the dock. As Papa rowed through the harbor, a military band on shore struck up a tune. The crisp rattle of drums and the clear tones of bugles drifted over the water. It was a fine music for Independence Day, both fierce and lively. The skiff sailed out of the harbor and into the open water of Lake Ontario. Waves danced blue and green into the distance. Caroline laughed for the pure joy of it all. Shall I raise the sail? She asked. You're the captain, Papa told her. Within minutes, Caroline had set the sail. Snap! The wind caught the canvas. Miss Caroline skimmed over the water. A gull called it as it glided overhead. Caroline felt her spirits rise even higher and soar toward the horizon. And that's the end of the chapter.